Okay, now I'd like to move to some more explicit consideration of the so-called hidden curriculum, which is all of that informal, unofficial stuff that we learn in school along with the stuff that we actually get tested on. Some education theorists have argued that there are multiple curricula going on at the same time in any given school. And here's one way of breaking it down schematically. So, moving from the top left, we have the explicit curriculum, which is those academic subjects where you get a syllabus, you're going to be tested at the end of the course, you get marks for it, and so forth. Assessments tend to be standardized. This is what the teacher, thinks that they are teaching you. Moving counterclockwise, there's what gets referred to as the extra curriculum, which is those organized activities that supplement the explicit curriculum. So this would be things like sports, student government, band, music, activities like that aren't formally assessed or evaluated, that aren't considered academic subjects, but are nonetheless explicitly endorsed by and organized by the school itself. Then moving across the bottom, this is an interesting one. This is the notion of the null curriculum, which is a way Eisler, an educational researcher who's quite influential in the 90s and early 2000s, argued that every school has its null curriculum as well as its explicit curriculum. And these are the things that students don't learn. You may have often have heard people say that life skills, important things for adulting and so forth, are not learned in school. Eisler would say that's part of the null curriculum. The options that you don't get, the things that you are not taught, that you don't learn about, the skills and the concepts that do not become part of your own repertoire of things that you can do and things that you know. So the null curriculum is the silences, the gaps, the things that are invisible or unspoken. And then what I'm going to mainly focus on here is the hidden or implicit curriculum, which is those experiences, in the lunchroom, in the locker room, in the mornings before classes, in the afternoons, after classes, what goes on at class change. Increasingly, these days, the implicit curriculum has left, it's no longer bounded by the geographical limits of the school. And it's what goes on in chat groups, in like text message chains, on house party and so forth. And living with a teenage daughter, I've learned a whole lot in the last year or so about the ways that the implicit curriculum kind of overspills the actual confines of the school to disperse itself through the internet and to keep students learning, whether they realize it or not, keep them learning and absorbing the ideas that are transmitted through the culture of their particular school or their particular educational institution. So, implicit curriculum, extremely powerful. What has it got to teach about gender? Well, before we get to gender, I want to just talk for a moment about some of the ways that sociologists and historians of education have theorized or conceptualized the hidden curriculum. And it's usually, the hidden curriculum is usually conceptualized as a force which reinforces hierarchies or inequalities in a broader society. Schools, like formal schools, are viewed as socializing institutions that essentially, um, through their academic subjects and through the non-academic stuff, prepare students to become certain types of adults that will fit into a hierarchical social order. So Emile Durkheim, one of the founders of sociology, believed that whether intended or not, that's one of the functions of schools. Bowles and Gintis, who are prominent in the history of education and the sociology of education, argued that schools function to reproduce inequalities. And to break that down a little bit, we have scholars like Willis and Fine, who argue that schools prepare students to occupy certain positions in racial hierarchies. In Fine's work, where she documents how schools explicitly and implicitly in the US have tracked African American students along paths that lead them to, you know, not have as much access to the labor force, not have as much access to post secondary education or economic hierarchies. Paul Willis' work, Learning to Labor on the United Kingdom, examining the ways in which the sort of peer culture within schools uh, encouraged or shaped the experiences of kids from lower middle class or lower income backgrounds such that they ended up in, you know, precarious, debilitating, low paying work, while other kids from wealthier backgrounds, their experiences at school uh, kind of fit them to sort of slide into white collar jobs that were secure and well paid and professional. Annette Lareau in the US has done a lot of work on the ways in which the informal arrangements of schools and what kids learn there serve to enhance or to underline the advantages that uh, wealthy white families have, or families with highly educated people, as compared to families that may not be wealthy, that may not be white, that may not have a high degree, high level of education among the adults in that family. So Lareau argues that one of the things schools do is they magnify and they exacerbate the inequalities that originate in the homes of students. So there's a long tradition of seeing the hidden curriculum as a way of uh, preparing students, or, well, preparing sounds like it's sort of deliberate and on purpose, shaping students into people who occupy certain positions within unequal structures among which gender relations figures. So, in the work that's been done on how the hidden curriculum interacts with gender, here are some of the sort of broad conclusions. One is that particularly around the grade 6, 7, 8 level, um, schools and the peer groups that are formed in schools and the way students interact serve to intensify um, both a gender binary and also gender conformity. You know, girls learn what it is like to be a girl or what they should do to be a proper girl. Boys learn the same thing from their male peers. Schools are where often, because in your classroom, you know, you're typically the same age as everybody else. Schools are where the opportunities exist for sort of girls to coalesce into a group, boys to coalesce into a group, because that's where you're surrounded by the greatest number of kids that are like you, helped along in some cases, as I mentioned in my little autobiographical thing, by the actions of teachers. Another aspect of hidden curriculum and gender that's been documented extensively is among girls, a fall off, a decline in perceptions of self efficacy and self esteem, beginning again around that grade 6 point and continuing on, sometimes with an uptick towards the end of high school, but there's something about the school environment, about being around all these other kids of the same age going through the same experiences in a gendered world that seems to affect girls such that even though their academic performance is good, in terms of psychological well-being and self-esteem, they appear to take a hit more so than boys. Big thing that goes on in schools and in school peer cultures is the encouragement of heteronormativity, which, as many of you probably know, is a word for the um, naturalization of heterosexuality from the to secure heterosexuality as the normal, natural, sort of desirable state of affairs. The pressure to be, or at least appear to be, heterosexual, and along with it, the naturalization of the gender binary: girls, boys, male, female, one or the other. If you're male, you should be interested in females. If you're female, you should be interested in males. Um, the world is heteronormative, but as we'll see in a moment, schools, particularly high schools, are a real kind of breeding ground of heteronormative uh, pressures, compulsions that continue to be acted out throughout adult life. And unfortunately, along with heteronormativity, often goes homophobia, which is the hatred or the fear of anything that is uh, that suggests homosexuality or that can be taken for or understood as homosexual. So heteronormativity refers to the sort of positive encouragement that's given to the appearance of heterosexuality, if not the substance of it. Homophobia refers to the negative discouragement that's given to um, anything which could be interpreted as involving same-sex attraction or involving being gay. And these two, heteronormativity and homophobia, have been the focus of a lot of research and a lot of interventions into hidden curricula. So one of the ways that this manifests, well, several of the ways in which this manifests, one is the idea of emphasized femininity for girls. This is the notion that girls' worth is measured by their orientation, their outlook ought to be guided by um, what will be appealing to boys and what will place them in a sort of subordinate yet attractive position vis-a-vis heterosexual males around them. So the emphasis on being popular, being attractive. Of course, there's also, for girls, the whole double bind thing. Don't, you need to be popular and attractive, but you can't be too popular and attractive because then you risk getting the slut label placed upon you. But we're managing one's femininity in a way that is presumed to be appealing to heterosexual male peers becomes something that girls feel under pressure to do. For boys, the gendering that goes on as part of the hidden curriculum often has a more negative or aggressive edge to it. Whereas emphasized femininity is based on trying to appeal to someone, the forms of masculinity that are often valorized among boy peer groups have this quality of hostility, of being against or opposed to something else. So this often takes the form of a sort of sexualized hostility. This may be expressed towards girls through degrading or insulting or offensive language and behavior, sometimes escalating into forms of assault or abuse. And also towards, within the male peer group, towards boys who are perceived as being somehow like girls, being effeminate, not being manly enough. And I want to um, just give you a long quote here from C.J. Pascoe, who's an anthropologist who's studied what she calls, and you know, forgive my language, it's from Pascoe's fieldwork, the fag discourse in high school. And her big insight from her fieldwork with American high school students was that this propensity for high school boys to call each other fags, to talk about who was in quotes gay all the time, had was not just about, maybe this is a boy who likes other boys over there. It's teaching boys how to secure their own masculinity through the repudiation or the rejection of anything that was deemed effeminate or um, girl like, and thereby consigned to this whole category of things that were, in heavy quotes, gay. So in her fieldwork, she writes, in the context of River High, being called a fag had as much to do with failing at tasks of masculinity than did with sexual desire. So using this term about somebody else wasn't necessarily really about their sexuality. It was about whether they were uh, succeeding at these masculine behaviors or not. More often than not, these in quotes fag-like behaviors were those associated with femininity, exhibiting stupidity, emotions, incompetence, caring too much about clothing, touching another guy or dancing, were all things which could render a boy vulnerable to this epithet used by other boys. So Pascoe says what she calls in high school peer groups the fag discourse is not just about homophobia, it's about a particularly gendered homophobia, as these renouncements of the fag, boys, pushing away either other boys or certain behaviors because they were, being a fag. They were about repudiating femininity. They were about hostility towards anything that was sort of coded or understood as feminine, as about denying same sex desire. So, this propensity to use these uh, derogatory terms for homosexuality is about homophobia, but it's also about, for boys, securing or shoring up a certain type of masculinity. And yeah, and Eminem here uh, says it with a lot fewer syllables than the academic sociologist. It doesn't mean gay people, it means taking away your manhood. And studies of hidden curricula for boys in high schools keep kind of coming back to this both homophobic and sexist discourse that circulates around this idea of repudiating anything that's feminine or in quotes uh, fag like. So that's kind of depressing. And one of the really good things that I've seen happening over the last decade or so in elementary and secondary education is that there's counterweights, counter discourses to a lot of the negative hidden curriculum or implicit curriculum stuff that goes on. So it's no longer as monolithic. So secondary schools are changing. And with that optimistic thought that they are changing in mind, let's take a look now at post-secondary education as this filtered, slightly more elite, if you want to call it, form of education that feeds young adults, whether they're men or women or non-binary or however they identify themselves, into a fuller adulthood. So, gender and education as pathways to adulthood historically have been different, whether you are male or female. And we don't have enough information yet about how this is shaped for people who are non-binary or who identify outside the sort of male-female polarity. So I'm going to have to resort to binary information here. On the left side of the screen, things that are more common among males than females when it comes to the movement into post-secondary education and adulthood. Boys are more likely than girls to move directly from high school into the workforce. And we see this in the increasing preponderance of post-secondary students who are girls. Boys are also more likely to go to colleges, technical colleges, in Edmonton, that would be like NAIT, uh, Norquest, rather than to the university that gives you the full bachelor's degree. Colleges tend to be more closely aligned to particular jobs, and that this is part of the for males and females compared, males moving more directly into the workforce post after they finish secondary school. In Alberta, in particular, we see the influence of the resource economy, the ups and downs associated with oil and gas um, being imprinted probably more so on male students than on female students. So when we're in a boom phase of the boom and bust cycle, you see a lot more male students who move directly into the workforce rather than post-secondary education. When we're in a bust phase, you see a lot of male students moving into further education rather than going straight into work from high school. Whereas on the female side, the boom and bust doesn't really affect pathways or trajectories quite so much. So females, more so than males, we've seen over the last few decades an increase in female post-secondary enrollment that has been much faster and much greater than increases in post-secondary enrollment for males. We see more of a diversification of post-secondary paths. So university, colleges, other forms of post-secondary education and training are more female students are more sort of dispersed amongst these than we see for male students. And even within universities, female students, as you'll uh, see in a few slides, tend to be dispersed more broadly amongst majors and programs than male students. And finally, and significantly, the financial returns to university are higher for female students than they are for males. So the value of a university education in terms of, over the course of your lifetime, how much money you're going to make is higher for women than for men. And that's what we're looking at here. So what you see here is by level of education, women's average annual income as a percentage of that of men with the same level of education. So there's a gender gap in income at all levels. There's no level of education where men and women are, on a par, but the gender gap is most pronounced at the high school level. So women who whose highest level of education is high school earn, on average, about two-thirds of what a man with a similar level of education makes. But when you look at women who get bachelor's degrees, and even more so women who have postgraduate degrees like MAs or MSCs or PhDs, that gender gap shrinks such that women with postgraduate degrees are almost on a par with their male peers. So the returns to education for women are greater than they are for men. And we can see this in the way that the more education you have, the smaller the gender parity gap. And this is a pattern which differentiates women in post-secondary education from their male counterparts. Within post-secondary education, well, a couple of things are noticeable. One is that there are more women than men on a university campus. Um, and the other is that this distribution is different across different faculties. So here, this is for Canada as a whole from StatsCan. We can see that women predominate in not all fields, but many, if not most of them. So big female predominance in education, in humanities like philosophy, literature, fine arts. Actually, fine arts is technically is into humanity, but philosophy, literature, languages, we see more female students than males. Social sciences like sociology, anthropology, political science, even more so. Business getting close to half and half. Engineering is the outlier. Engineering, although it's changed a lot from where it was 10, 15 years ago, it's still really a bastion of male students. And computer science is also an outlier where you have that the classroom is predominantly consists of male students. But these two, there's been a lot of movement and change in male dominated areas in terms of more female students coming in. Not quite the same in female dominated areas. We have not seen an influx of male students into education or nursing or humanities. Nothing like the way we've seen female students moving into engineering and to the STEM fields, mathematics and applied science and so forth. So this is what I meant a slide or two back when I said that female post-secondary students tend to have more diversified representation in post-secondary education than male students. They are both in those areas that are predominantly female, and they're moving into those areas that have historically been predominantly male. What's going on with this? What's driving this? So many things are driving this. Why are there more women in education, in university, I should say, now than compared to years ago, decades ago, a generation ago? I'm just going to name check a few of the reasons, starting at the top left. As I've just shown, there are those greater economic returns to a university degree for females than for males. Moving across the top, this may not be the first thing that comes to mind, but it's a driver of post-secondary education. The rising age at marriage for women as compared to, say, the baby boom days when women were getting married on average when they were 21 or so. As age at marriage rises, so does the representation of women in post-secondary education, because typically women complete their education before they marry. Which is driving which? Does rising age at marriage drive post-secondary education or vice versa? It's not clear, but the two are linked. Generational modeling. Young women today are more likely than at any other time in Canadian history to have had a mother who was also university educated or who also went to post-secondary education. So, following the big expansions in the 70s and 80s, we now have a sort of second generation, or in some cases, even a third generation of female students whose mothers and grandmothers also went to university. The changes in so-called feminized jobs, those sectors of the workforce that where women predominate, have been changes in the direction of becoming more professionalized, requiring more certifications and credentials and so forth. Teaching is a great example of this. The rise of the Bachelor of Education, or even the after degree, or even the Master's in Education as a prerequisite for teaching in an elementary or high school has happened over the last decade or so, or last generation, rather, I should say. It's been more than a decade. Um, Similar things have happened in nursing, in associated healthcare fields. We're now seeing it happen in early childhood education, where a 4-year degree or even some form of after degree is starting to be kind of the bare minimum for a job in those sectors. Girls increasing secondary achievement. I talked a while earlier about the gender gap in science and math, shrinking, and in some measurements actually disappearing, has meant that you've got more girls, your young women who have the qualifications and the achievements to enter into a range of university fields. And finally, this sort of very kind of broad and philosophical changing expectations of life paths for young women more so than for young men. So the shift away from the assumption or expectation that the adult life course would be characterized by marriage and parenting, towards an assumption or an expectation that the adult life course would incorporate a profession, paid work, a career, articulated somehow with marriage, with parenting, with being a mother and being a spouse. These changing expectations of what life holds for women have also driven the great influx of women into post-secondary education over the last generation or so. Nonetheless, post-secondary education is still what we could call a leaky pipeline. And what this means is that the further you go along this pipeline, the further you go up the educational or the post-secondary educational ladder, the more men you find relative to women. So women, it's not the nicest metaphor in the whole world, but women leak, they kind of like drip out of the pipeline as it goes up the hill and goes to higher and higher academic levels. So even though women enter post-secondary education in greater numbers than men, they also are not, they become less and less well represented as you move up